Welcome to our lecture on the book of Proverbs. It's sometimes described as a manual for living, and I think that's probably right on the money. Dr. Dorsey gave this information about the book of Proverbs. He said that it comprises a collection of wise sayings. In some respects, it is the most practical, down-to-earth book in the Bible. We learn in it that the God of Israel was deeply interested in how his people conducted their daily lives, how they worked, how they related to one another, how they made their daily decisions, how they ate, how they related to their spouses and other family members, how they treated their animals, how they organized their workday, how they prioritized their tasks, how they handled temptations, how they behaved in private, even how they reasoned and thought internally. So this book is full of wonderfully practical advice from the heart and mind of God. And we're going to focus today on the first 7 verses of this book, which really provide us with Solomon's own introduction to Proverbs, explaining in a poetic form the purposes for which this book was written. And so in Proverbs 1 we read, "The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, for gaining wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for receiving instruction in prudent behavior, doing what is right and just and fair, for giving prudence to those who are simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. Let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance. For understanding proverbs and parables, the sayings and riddles of the wise. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction." So what is a proverb? Most proverbs are short, compact statements that express truths about human behavior. But this book also contains longer discourses on practical subjects about life in this world, how we relate to God and to one another. Fee and Stewart state that the Proverbs are rules and regulations people can use to help themselves make responsible, successful choices in life. I also like Garrett's definition in his New American Commentary on Proverbs, that a proverb is a short, artistically constructed, ethical observation or teaching. The Hebrew term masal, in the singular, basically means a comparison, which is why many of the proverbs in this book are short, usually 2 lines in length, comparing, contrasting, or repeating. Bullock bears this out in our text when he states that a proverb is a statement that seeks to reveal the true nature of one thing by comparing it to something else. And Kidner, in his commentary on the book of Proverbs, states that a proverb is a style of teaching that provokes the reader's thought, getting under his skin by thrusts of wit, paradox, common sense, and teasing symbolism in preference to the preacher's tactic of frontal assault. Now, Garrett, in his commentary, the New American Commentary, notes that there are numerous forms of wisdom literature found in the book of Proverbs. The first of those would be sayings. A saying is a statement that describes human behavior with or without an explicit moral evaluation. So, for example, in Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 1, the last part of the verse states, "A wise son brings joy to his father, but a foolish son grief to his mother." We usually think of proverbs as short sayings, but there are longer forms as well, such as admonitions. And these are commands or prohibitions, sometimes with a warning of what will happen if the prohibition is violated. For example, in Proverbs 6, verses 1 to 5, we have a warning against co-signing for someone's loan. My child, if you have put up security for a friend's debt, or agreed to guarantee the debt of a stranger, if you have trapped yourself by your agreement and are caught by what you said, follow my advice and save yourself, for you have placed yourself at your friend's mercy. Now swallow your pride, go and beg to have your name erased. Don't put it off. Do it now. Don't rest until you do. Save yourself like a gazelle escaping from a hunter, like a bird fleeing from a net. We also find in the book of Proverbs numerical sayings. These are lists of items that have something in common. For example, we find in Proverbs chapter 30, verses 18 and 19, there are 3 things that amaze me. No, 4 things that I don't understand. How an eagle glides through the sky, how a snake slithers on a rock, how a ship navigates the ocean, how a man loves a woman. We also find rhetorical questions, the answers to which seem sometimes misleadingly obvious, and they are meant to draw the reader into reflection. Who but God goes up to heaven and comes back down? This is found in Proverbs chapter 30 and verse 4. Who but God goes up to heaven and comes back down? Who holds the wind in his fists? Who wraps up the oceans in his cloak? Who has created the whole wide world? What is his name and his son's name? Tell me if you know. We also find another form of wisdom literature in the book of Proverbs would be wisdom poems. This would be wisdom teaching presented as a fully developed poem or an alphabetic acrostic, such as the virtuous woman of Proverbs 31. And finally, we also have example stories, and this would be a brief story or anecdote meant to drive home a teaching on virtue. For example, in Proverbs chapter 7, verses 6 to 27, we have a lengthy example story concerning the immoral woman and how the young men need to stay far, far away from her. But also in Proverbs 24, there's a little shorter story found concerning laziness. Proverbs 24, verses 30 to 34 says, I walked by the field of a lazy person, the vineyard of one with no common sense. I saw that it was overgrown with nettles. It was covered with weeds, and its walls were broken down. Then, as I looked and thought about it, I learned this lesson. A little extra sleep, a little more slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. Kind of makes you want to go to sleep, doesn't it? Then poverty will pounce on you like a bandit. Scarcity will attack you like an armed robber. Now, as you have read through the Proverbs, perhaps you have found some additional forms beyond these that Garrett has mentioned. But it's important for us to remember that the Proverbs are meant to be studied and meditated upon, but also that they are meant to be obeyed. And we also need to remember that these are not universal promises from God. Some people read the Proverbs as absolute promises that God is making to every person upon the face of the earth, applicable to every possible situation that we face. And so they will read a verse like, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it, Proverbs 22:6. But then they get disappointed with God when their children get older or out on their own, and they wander off the path of their parents' careful biblical training. But we also should not see the Proverbs as just kind of hopeful advice that if you do this, maybe it'll work out for you. I think either extreme misses the mark. Maybe we should think of the Proverbs in the sense that they are meant to be our counselors, to give us advice for living. When we go to a doctor, we go there for medical advice, essentially. And if we don't like the advice she gives us, we go to another doctor until we find one who agrees with us. The first 6 doctors probably will tell us something like this: you need to lose weight and exercise more. But doctor number 7 tells us that we are perfectly healthy and that we need to eat as much as we can while reclining on the couch watching exercise videos. And we like that advice. We can live by that. Just kidding. We need to pay careful attention to what the Proverbs are saying and pray that God will give us the discernment we need to understand how this applies to our situation, and then follow that advice so that we can be living wisely in God's world. Now, in chapter 1 and verse 1 of Proverbs, the author is identified as Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. I think it is important for us to understand something about the author of this book. And if you would think back over our study of Kings, we have the account of Solomon making all kinds of offerings for God at Gibeon, and then God came to him in a dream and said to him, "Ask what I shall give you." He asked him for what he wanted, what Solomon wanted. And Solomon's response was, "Give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong, for who is able to govern this great people of yours?" This word discerning heart is literally a hearing heart. It was a heart that was ready to listen. And God was really pleased with his request, and he granted Solomon what he asked for, and then some. This ability to distinguish right from wrong was shortly put to the test. We find also in 1 Kings chapter 3 the story of the 2 prostitutes who came to Solomon for justice. One prostitute said, "The other woman rolled over onto her baby during the night and smothered him, and then took the dead son and put him next to me, and she took my son." But the other prostitute said, "Oh, no, the live son is mine, the dead one is hers." So Solomon called for a sword, and he said, "Cut the living baby in 2, give half to the one and half to the other." And the real mother cried out, saying, "Give her the baby, don't kill him." And so Solomon recognized that she was the true mother and gave the baby to her. And it tells us in verse 28 of 1 Kings 3, when all Israel heard the verdict the king had given, they held the king in awe because they saw that he had wisdom from God to administer justice. Now Solomon developed quite a reputation for his wisdom all through the known world. In 1 Kings chapter 4, it says, God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the people of the East and greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than anyone else, and his fame spread to all the surrounding nations. From all nations, people came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world who had heard of his wisdom. And then in chapter 10, we have the visit by the Queen of Sheba. When the Queen of Sheba heard about the fame of Solomon and his relationship to the Lord, she came to test Solomon with hard questions. Arriving at Jerusalem with a very great caravan with camels carrying spices, large quantities of gold, and precious stones, she came to Solomon and talked with him about all that she had on her mind. Solomon answered all her questions. Nothing was too hard for the king to explain to her. When the Queen of Sheba saw all the wisdom of Solomon, and the palace he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his officials, the attending servants in their robes, his cupbearers, and the burnt offerings he made at the temple of the Lord. She was overwhelmed. She said to the king, "The report I heard in my own country about your achievements and your wisdom is true. But I did not believe these things until I came and saw with my own eyes. Indeed, not even half was told me. In wisdom and wealth, you have far exceeded the report I heard. How happy your people must be, how happy your officials who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom. Praise be to the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and placed you on the throne of Israel. Because of the Lord's eternal love for Israel, he has made you king to maintain justice and righteousness." So Solomon attracted a good deal of attention from the surrounding nations for his wisdom, but we also know that Solomon was famous for his writing of proverbs and poems. Also in 1 Kings 4, verse 32, we read, "He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He spoke about plant life, from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of walls. He also spoke about animals and birds, reptiles and fish." We also would know that not all 3,000 proverbs were recorded for us in the book of Proverbs. Now, I have not taken the time to count them. As fun as that might be to do, maybe that would be something you would like to do. But the estimate of 900 proverbs in the book of Proverbs is probably closer to what is actually there. And all those proverbs, the 900 proverbs, are not all of Solomon's. We have sections that are titled Sayings of the Wise, and sections authored by Agur and by the mother of King Lemuel. And in Proverbs 25, we read, "These are more proverbs of Solomon copied by the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, that there had been a time of spiritual restoration and renewal under Hezekiah, and therefore a great interest in the words of Solomon, and a desire for the people of the nation to live righteously and wisely." So Dillard and Longman concluded that while other contributors of Proverbs were included in this book, this opening verse identifies Solomon as the main contributor and initiator of the anthology. Now, these opening verses also identify the purposes for the writing of this book. Remember that this is poetry, and remember what was said was the single most important aspect of Hebrew poetry? If you said parallelism, you would be correct. The purpose statements in this passage begin with synonymous parallelisms. Notice in verse 2, where it says, "To know wisdom and instruction, to discern the words of understanding." And then verse 3 is generally translated for receiving instruction in prudent behavior, doing what is right and just and fair, which would be synthetic parallelism, but the literal Hebrew reads, to receive the instruction, to give attention to justice and judgment and equity. Then we find synthetic parallelism in the next verse, verse 4, to give to the naive subtlety and to the youth knowledge and discretion. And then in verse 5, we have, again, synonymous parallelism. Let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance. I have on the screen the literal order of the words in the Hebrew text. And then in verse 6, we again have synthetic parallelism, to understand a proverb and the interpretation, the words of the wise and their dark sayings. And then we have antithetical parallelism in verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but wisdom and instruction fools despise. Now, in addition to the parallelism of the lines of the poem, there's also a pattern in the verb tenses used in these verses. And so in verse 2, 3, 4, and in 6, we have infinitive verbs. And then in verse 5, we have imperfects, which are generally translated as future tense, but they can also be interpreted as what are called jussives, which are commands. And so it's probably better to translate this, let hear a wise man, and let increase in learning, and a man of understanding to wise counsels, let attain. That would be closer to the original Hebrew. So we have a clue then in these verb forms that 4 of these verses are parallel to each other. We have 2, 3, 4, and 6, all beginning with infinitive verbs. And then in verse 5, we have this series of imperfects or jussives or commands, which I believe is meant to show a break in the thought that what he's saying here is he's giving these 5 main purposes of the Proverbs. But then he interrupts that list with these commands to pay attention, wake up, listen to what I'm saying. Really, we could just summarize that in one word, and that's listen. And think about this when you're reading through this book. Take note of all the times this command comes up. I was amazed by this as I read once more through Proverbs. For example, the very next verse in chapter 1, verse 8, listen, my son, to your father's instruction. Do not forsake your mother's teaching. And this book, the book of Proverbs, is just loaded with this command or something synonymous to it. And so as you're reading through this book, pay attention. Listen for these synonyms for this command to wake up and listen and pay attention. Remember Solomon's prayer. I think this is why this is so significant. Solomon's prayer was, give me a hearing heart. And he knew how vital that would be for him to fulfill the role God had given to him. And it's equally vital for all of us, no matter what God calls us to do in our lives, that we need to have a heart that is ready to listen to what God has said and then be quick to obey him. And then in verse 7, he gives us the main theme of the entire book. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. And we'll look at that in just a little while. This passage has a number of synonyms for wisdom. And so I think that it's important for us to define these terms. Kidner, in his commentary on Proverbs, said that the book of Proverbs opens by breaking up the plain daylight of wisdom into its rainbow of constituent colors. I love that. I love the way he says that, and it inspired me. And so I went into the text and I color-coded all the different synonyms that he used in here for wisdom. If you'll notice, wisdom is repeated in verse 2 and verse 7. Understanding, insight, discerning, and understanding are all synonymous in the original Hebrew. We have instruction, in these three verses, in verses 2, 3, and 7. And then prudent behavior is only found in verse 3. There is a word similar to that, the shrewdness or prudence, but it's a slightly different word that's used there. We also have this knowledge in verse 4 and verse 7, and also the word discretion, and that's different from the word learning. And so Kidner's phrase, his rainbow of constituent colors, I found just so inspiring and caused me to do my nerdy kind of stuff. But this word wisdom is very, very important. It refers to skill in living according to God's will in the practical matters of life. In the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament, Louis Goldberg says that wisdom is reflected in Old Testament, as reflected in Old Testament wisdom, is the teaching of a personal God who is holy and just, and who expects those who know him to exhibit his character in the many practical affairs of life. This perfect blend of the revealed will of a holy God with the practical human experiences of life is also distinct from the speculative wisdom of the Greeks. The ethical dynamic of Greek philosophy lay in the intellect. If a person had perfect knowledge, he could live the good life. Thinking of Plato there. Knowledge was virtue. The emphasis of Old Testament wisdom was that the human will in the realm of practical matters was to be subject to divine causes. Therefore, Hebrew wisdom was not theoretical and speculative. It was practical, based on revealed principles of right and wrong to be lived out in daily life. When we think about this, we realize that the world was designed with order by the Creator, and so the first principle of wisdom is to discover the skill to lead a life of moral order in an ordered universe. Fred Putnam from Westminster Seminary said this in a lecture on the book of Proverbs. He said, "We find the words wise and wisdom often in the book of Proverbs, but in the Bible they are translated in a way that really refers to skill. If you go back to the book of Exodus and read the stories of Aholiab and Bezaleel, the craftsmen of whom the Lord said he had given special wisdom or skill in working with wood, metal, and cloth, that's the same word that's used here. Chokmah, or wisdom, is really a kind of skill in living or skill in doing anything in particular. In the book of Proverbs, it seems to be skill in understanding, and the understanding is both the understanding of the Proverbs themselves, as well as the ability to understand life, and to understand the circumstances that we face, and to understand how we are to apply these Proverbs to our daily lives, what God wants us to do, and how he wants us to live. We need to understand that the Lord is showing us what he wants us to be, not because he's a bully, but because he knows that is how we will be most happy. He knows what will be best for us. Another word that we find in the book of Proverbs is the word instruction or training, and it's sometimes translated as discipline, chastening, or correction. So just as wisdom is the ability to understand the way we are to live and how to make right choices and live a God-honoring life, so we need the discipline of God to move us back onto the right track when we make the wrong choices. According to the New Testament, this discipline is proof of our relationship with God because he disciplines his children, and he does this out of love. Another word that is used would be understanding or insight. And this Hebrew word for understanding is binah, and it carries the idea of discernment. And that's really the idea behind Solomon's prayer for wisdom in 1 Kings 3:9, that I may discern between good and evil. And so the person who is truly wise is able to separate, to discriminate, or to read between the lines. And we need to do this, especially as we study the Proverbs, because there are some Proverbs that seem to be contradictory. Classic example of that is Proverbs 26 and verse 4, that says, "Don't answer the foolish arguments of fools, or you will become as foolish as they are." And then in the very next verse, we find Proverbs 26:5, "Be sure to answer the foolish arguments of fools, or they will become wise in their own estimation," or in their own eyes. And if you think about this, both statements are true, but we need discernment to know when we should answer a fool and when we need to keep quiet. So I'll let you think about that a little bit more. There's another word that's found in this passage, and that is wise dealing, which means to act prudently, to act wisely. It's the ability to size up a situation and respond accordingly. We also find the word shrewdness or subtlety. It's to know one's way about and plan our course realistically. This word shrewdness does have a bad sense to it. If you look at Proverbs 12:2, it tells us that this shrewdness can often degenerate into mere scheming. But there is a positive sense in the word where it's to know our way and plan our course realistically. That would be a good sense of this word shrewdness. There's another, and that's discretion, which is the ability to make plans that will have the best outcome. Or the word knowledge or learning. It's the knowing of truth and indeed of God himself. And then the word guidance, which means it's that which captivates one's mind. And so think with me about this rainbow of constituent colors of wisdom. The book of Proverbs was to help us to develop all of these skills in our lives so that we would live a God-honoring life of fulfillment, abundance, and lasting satisfaction, that we would know how to make good decisions and walk in the best ways through life, to discern how to apply the truth to each unique situation, with the result that we would cultivate qualities of character such as a disciplined and prudent life and doing what is just and right and fair. Now, those are the purposes, I think, of the book of Proverbs. Now, also in this text, we find different people who will read and respond to the teaching that's found there. The first that he mentions would be the simple or the naive. This is the kind of person who is easily led or persuaded, someone who might be gullible or easily enticed. Sometimes it's translated even as silly. And it's not that this person is a fool, but he is simply inexperienced and simply hasn't lived life long enough, or has not been adequately instructed in wisdom. It also mentions the young. This would be boys or girls, young ones who need education in all areas of life. And thirdly, we have the wise. This is not necessarily older people, but it's those who have been instructed but simply need reminders. You see, we never reach a point in our lives where we can say that we know all there is to know. And if we are truly wise, we will be always recognizing our need to be digging deeper and learning more. But then this passage also mentions the fools. I'm sorry, I just couldn't resist the Three Stooges here. These are people who despise wisdom and instruction. This would be someone you cannot really teach, either because he thinks he already knows everything, those who are wise in his own eyes, such as in Proverbs 26:5, or someone who gets impatient when someone tries to challenge or clarify his thinking. It certainly sounds like some political types, doesn't it? Moving right along, the ultimate goal of wisdom and the major theme of the book of Proverbs is found in verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. The word beginning there means the starting point or the foundation or essence of knowledge. And what it's teaching us is that true knowledge or wisdom begins with fearing God. Does that mean that we must be afraid of God before we can truly learn anything? There are numerous places in the Bible where people encountered God and they were absolutely terrified. They meet the Lord, they fall down on their faces, they seem to faint or pass out. But Kidner, in his commentary, described the fear of the Lord as a healthy respect for the Almighty. And I think that's probably close to a good understanding of what this phrase really means. That if we really comprehend who God really is, that he is not some heavenly buddy in the sky, nor some senile grandfather who is blissfully unaware of what the kids are really doing, nor some heavenly vending machine where you pop in the right prayer with a suitable good work and out will pop the blessing you want. No, God is the Lord and the Creator of the universe with great grace and great justice, who is perfectly righteous and perfectly loving, who has placed his laws into effect, and they are universally applicable. And someday we will be held accountable for what we do and how we live and how we treated the people around us, and further realize that by ignoring his precepts and resenting his boundaries and resisting his restraints, we are sinning against love. I like how Trayer expressed this in his commentary, that God's perfect love casts out servile fear of punishment, so that charity can instill in us the holy fear of disappointing our beloved Father. And that is where true wisdom begins, with a relationship with Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, and knowing that he loves us, that we know he wants what is ultimately best for us and for his creation. And because we grow to love him, we want to do all that we can to live lives that bring him honor. And so the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. How do we grow in that wisdom? I mentioned Fred Putnam earlier from Westminster Seminary. He has a really good illustration of how we grow in wisdom. Do you remember when you were younger? Your mother said, "Don't touch the stove, you'll burn yourself." Now, when we're 2 years old, we don't know what burn means. So we touch the stove, we burn ourselves, and now we know what it means to burn ourselves. And we know why we should not touch the stove. Or we might learn because someone else tells us. So our mother could say, "Don't touch the stove, you'll burn yourself," and so we don't touch the stove. Now, what have we learned? We haven't learned that the stove is hot. We don't really know why we should not touch the stove, but we've learned obedience. The result of both may be the same in the long run. We won't burn ourselves anymore. It's much more painful to learn many things by personal experience than it is to learn them from someone else. And I believe what Solomon is doing is giving us the opportunity of learning from the accumulated experience of the wise men of the ancient Near East, taking their sayings and saying those things are worth pondering and thinking about. And therefore, we need to take the time to do that as well. And so, as we enter into this study of Proverbs this week, would you pray for God to give you a hearing heart, that you might listen carefully to the accumulated wisdom in this book and be ready to obey it and apply it to every part of your life?